The morning Leopold Carrington decided to take a wife, he did not consult his heart. He consulted his lawyer. The documents were already prepared when Rosalind Beaumont arrived at Carrington House, a stack of papers sitting on a mahogany desk the size of a small boat, beside a crystal decanter of bourbon no one had touched, in a room that smelled of leather and cold ambition. She had been given 30 minutes' notice. She came anyway. That was the first thing Leopold noticed about her. Not her dress, though it was clearly her best one, pressed carefully and slightly out of season. Not her hands, though they were folded in her lap with the practiced stillness of a woman who had learned long ago that trembling was a luxury she could not afford. What he noticed was that she sat down before he offered her a chair. Small detail, but not small enough for him to miss it. Miss Beaumont. His voice carried the particular flatness of a man who had not needed to soften his words in a very long time. He remained standing behind the desk, which was almost certainly intentional. "I assume you've been informed of the terms." "I have." Her voice was steady. "Your solicitor was thorough." "Then you understand this is not a courtship." "I understand it is a business arrangement." A pause, precise as a scalpel. "As do you." Leopold Carrington looked at her then. Genuinely looked, not the brief assessment he gave to most people who entered this room. Rosalind Beaumont was the youngest daughter of Edmund Beaumont, who had once been a man of consequence in Dunraven Crossing and was now a man of debt. Her father owed Carrington Steel a sum that had quietly consumed the Beaumont estate over the course of 4 years, not through malice, but through the slow, grinding mathematics of compounding interest and a series of decisions Edmund Beaumont had made when he still believed himself untouchable. He was not untouchable. He had learned this recently. The arrangement was straightforward, as Leopold understood all arrangements to be. Rosalind would marry him. The Beaumont debt, $114,000 accumulated and documented on page 7 of the contract, would be dissolved entirely. Her family would retain the smaller house on Halcyon Street. In exchange, she would serve as Mrs. Leopold Carrington for no less than 2 years, appear beside him at required social functions, conduct herself with appropriate discretion, and make no claims upon his personal life, his business interests, or his time beyond what society demanded. There was a clause on page 4 she had read 3 times the night before, by lamplight, her father asleep in the next room, and her younger sister already asking questions Rosalind did not yet know how to answer. In the event of dissolution after the agreed period, Mrs. Carrington shall retain the residence on Halcyon Street in perpetuity and receive a sum of $12,000, provided all terms have been honored in full. $12,000. In 1887, in Dunraven Crossing, that was enough to make a woman free. Rosalind had not signed anything yet, but she had come. "There is one condition I would like to add," she said. Leopold's expression did not change exactly, but something in it shifted. A slight recalibration, the way a very precise man looks when the board does something unexpected. "The terms are finalized. The terms are proposed," she said. "I haven't signed them." A silence followed. "Not the comfortable kind." "Speak," he said at last. "My sister Clara is 17. She will need a proper season in 2 years, when this arrangement concludes." Rosalind kept her voice even, professional almost, a tone borrowed from necessity. "I'm asking that the settlement include an introduction to Mrs. Hartford's social circle on Clara's behalf. A written introduction, with your name on it. Nothing more. You're negotiating. I'm clarifying what I need in exchange for what you need, Mr. Carrington." She met his eyes without flinching. "Isn't that what a business arrangement is?" He studied her for a long moment. The fire in the hearth made small sounds. Outside, a carriage moved along the cobblestone street, the sound fading slowly until the room was entirely quiet. "Done," he said. He said it the way he said everything, without ceremony, without warmth, as though the word cost him nothing, which to Leopold Carrington it didn't. A letter to Mrs. Hartford was a trivial thing, a wife who would stabilize his social standing during the most critical acquisition of his career, the Dunraven Rail merger, which required the blessing of 3 old-money families who still believed a bachelor industrialist was a liability, was not trivial at all. He needed a respectable Mrs. Carrington at his side for the next 2 years. He needed someone who would not cause scenes, would not ask questions she wasn't supposed to ask, and would not mistake the arrangement for something it was not. Rosalind Beaumont, from everything his men had assessed, was practical, composed, and without romantic illusions. Her family's situation had burned those out of her years ago. She was, in his estimation, ideal. What he had not accounted for What could not be found in any file his solicitor prepared was the small leather notebook she carried in the inside pocket of her coat, the one she had been carrying for 3 years, the one that contained, in her own careful handwriting, a record of every financial transaction her father had made since the summer of '83. She had not shown it to anyone. Not yet. Rosalind signed the contract that afternoon. Her signature was clean and unhurried, the letters of her name formed with the kind of steadiness that only comes from having made a decision completely, without reservation or retreat. Leopold signed after her. He did not watch her do it. The wedding was scheduled for 3 weeks from Saturday. Small private, as befitting a business arrangement, the announcement in the Dunraven Crossing Gazette would describe it as a quiet union between 2 respected families. The word love would not appear anywhere in the text, which suited both parties. That evening, Rosalind walked home along the river road. The late autumn sky over Dunraven Crossing had gone the colour of cold iron, grey and flat and wide, and the gas lamps along the embankment were just beginning to flicker on one by one, casting long orange shapes across the water. She walked slowly, not because she was uncertain, because she was memorizing the feeling of being only herself in this particular evening light, for the last time before everything changed. Clara was waiting on the front steps of the house on Halcyon Street. "Well?" she said. Rosalind looked at her sister, 17 years old, still carrying the particular brightness of someone who had not yet learned to protect it, and felt something move quietly through her chest. Not regret. Something older and less nameable than regret. "It's done," she said. Clara searched her face. "Are you afraid?" Rosalind considered the question honestly, the way she considered most things. Then she climbed the steps, put her hand briefly on her sister's shoulder, and opened the front door. "I'm prepared," she said. "That's better." Inside, the house was warm and small and still theirs, for now and after, and because of a signature on a mahogany desk, in a room that smelled of leather and cold ambition. Rosalind set her coat on the chair by the door, the leather notebook pressed against her ribs. She did not take it out, not tonight. 3 weeks later, on a grey Saturday morning, Rosalind Beaumont walked into a church on the corner of Broad and Merchant Street and came out the other side as Mrs. Leopold Carrington. Her husband shook her hand at the door, not cruelly, not dismissively, simply, formally, the way you close an agreement. A firm, brief grip, and then he released her and turned to speak to his solicitor, who was waiting on the church steps with yet another document requiring his attention. Rosalind watched him for a moment. His back was straight. His suit was perfect. He moved through the world like a man who had never once questioned whether he belonged in it. She turned away and looked out at Dunraven Crossing, the smoke from the steel mills rising in long pale columns above the rooftops, the river silver and indifferent in the morning light, the city going about its Saturday business with complete disregard for the fact that something irreversible had just occurred on the steps of a church at the corner of Broad and Merchant. Something irreversible. She had known that before she signed. She had known it walking home along the river road. She had known it every night for 3 weeks while she lay awake in the small room on Halcyon Street, staring at the ceiling, the leather notebook on the nightstand beside her like a quiet, waiting thing. What she had not known, what she could not have known, standing outside that church on a grey Saturday morning with her husband's back to her, was that the notebook would matter far sooner than she had planned. That the Dunraven rail merger Leopold needed her for was not what it appeared to be, and that one of the signatures on page 7 of the contract she had signed 3 weeks ago, the one documenting her father's debt in full, was a forgery. Carrington House had 17 rooms. Rosalind knew this because she had counted them on her first full morning as its mistress, not out of admiration, but out of the same quiet instinct that had always made her map unfamiliar territory before she moved through it. 17 rooms, 4 staircases, 2 formal parlours that no one appeared to use, a library with floor-to-ceiling shelves and a fireplace that had clearly not been lit in months, and a dining room long enough that 2 people sitting at opposite ends of the table could, if they chose, conduct an entire meal without once making eye contact. Leopold chose this arrangement on their first evening together. He sat at the head of the table. She sat at the far end. Between them, 12 empty chairs, 3 silver candlesticks, a floral centerpiece that had been arranged by someone who did not know her preferences and had not thought to ask, and a silence so complete that Rosalind could hear the clock on the mantelpiece marking every single second. The food was excellent. She noted this with the detached appreciation of someone who understood that comfort, in this house, would arrive in impersonal forms. "The cook," she said after a while. "She's very good." Leopold looked up from the document beside his plate. He had brought documents to dinner which told her everything she needed to know about the nature of their evenings going forward. "Mrs. Holt has been with the house for 11 years. I'll want to speak with her tomorrow. About the weekly menus." A pause. Brief, but present. "That's your domain," he said, and returned to his document. "Your domain." She turned the phrase over quietly in her mind. Not dismissive, exactly. More like delegation. The efficient reassignment of a task he had no interest in managing himself. She was, in the architecture of Carrington House, a new department. Rosalind understood departments. She had been managing her father's household since she was 19 years old. She ate her dinner. The clock marked its seconds. Outside, Dunraven Crossing moved through its Tuesday evening without them. The days developed a structure, the way cold weather develops. Gradually and then all at once until you couldn't remember what the air had felt like before. Leopold left the house at 7:30 every morning, before the light had fully arrived. He returned at 7 in the evening, sometimes later. He kept to his study after dinner. He did not seek her company, and he did not avoid it in any pointed way. He simply moved through his own life with such complete self-containment that Rosalind's presence registered as atmospheric rather than personal. She was part of the house now, like the candlesticks, like Mrs. Holt. She did not resent this. She had not expected anything different. What she had not expected was how much she would observe. Rosalind Beaumont had spent years in reduced circumstances, which meant she had spent years watching people with power from a careful distance. She had learned to read rooms, to understand what a man's posture said when his words said something else, to notice which questions no one was answering and why. It was a skill acquired through necessity and sharpened through practice, and in Carrington House it ran constantly, quietly, like a river under ice. She observed that Leopold read everything, not skimmed, read with the focused attention of someone who trusted no summary and no intermediary. She observed that he received 3 visitors on Wednesdays, always the same 3, always in the study with the door closed, and that afterward he was quieter than usual, not troubled exactly, but contained in some new way, as though he had added weight and was redistributing it internally. She observed that he had no photographs anywhere in the house, not one. She did not ask about any of this, but she noticed. On the 9th day of their marriage, Leopold spoke to her outside of a meal for the first time. She was in the library, the unused one, with the cold fireplace, sitting in the window with a book she was genuinely reading, and a cup of tea that had gone cold beside her. She had found in the 3rd shelf from the left a complete collection of railroad surveys from the 1870s, bound in green cloth and organized by region. She had pulled 4 of them. She was not reading them idly. She heard his footstep in the doorway and looked up. He was looking at the surveys on the table beside her. Something moved across his face, quick and unreadable, gone before she could name it. "Those are old," he said, "1873 through 1879. She kept her voice neutral. "The Dunraven corridor surveys, mostly. Some of them reference land titles that were disputed at the time." She paused. "I find property history interesting." The silence that followed lasted 4 full seconds, she counted. "Do you?" he said. It was not quite a question. "My father kept records," she said simply. "I helped him organize them, for a long time." She closed the survey on her lap and set it on the table with the others unhurried. "I find that financial documents tell a more complete story than people generally expect them to." Leopold Carrington looked at her for a long moment. That recalibration again. She recognized it now, the slight shift behind his eyes when something did not behave according to his model of it. "Dinner is in an hour," he said. "Thank you," she said. He left. She waited until his footsteps had faded down the hall. Then she opened the survey again, turned to the section on land tenure disputes along the eastern Dunraven line, and read it very carefully. The first social event of their marriage was the alderman's autumn reception, held at the Dunraven Crossing City Hall on a Thursday evening in late October. It was the first time Rosalind appeared publicly as Mrs. Leopold Carrington, and she understood exactly what was being evaluated. The women of Dunraven Crossing's upper tier had spent the better part of 3 weeks constructing theories about the marriage, most of them unflattering to her, most of them accurate in outline, if not in detail. She was too quiet, too plain, too Beaumont, which meant too fallen, too indebted, too much a charity case dressed in good silk. She wore her best dress, which was genuinely good, dark green, simply cut, entirely appropriate, and she stood beside Leopold with the composure of a woman who had decided, before she left the house, exactly how much of herself to show and how much to hold in reserve. She held most of it in reserve. Leopold introduced her to 3 men whose names she already knew. Harlan Cross, who held the Eastern Rail contracts, Judge Emmett Pell, who had overseen 2 of the Carrington land acquisitions in the previous decade, and Thomas Aldgate, who was Leopold's primary competitor in the steel market, and who shook her hand with the slightly excessive warmth of someone filing information for later use. She smiled at all 3. She said the correct things. She did not say anything else, but she listened, and what she heard, in the spaces between the pleasantries and the bourbon toasts and the conversations that paused slightly when she approached, what she heard was Aldgate speaking quietly to a man she didn't recognize near the east window, using a specific phrase, the Dunraven deed of record. She did not react. She moved on, took a glass of water from a passing tray, and spent the next 20 minutes discussing the city's new public garden with Mrs. Emmett Pell, who was kind and slightly bored and entirely unaware that the woman beside her had just placed a piece of information into a mental architecture that had been quietly under construction for 3 years. On the carriage ride home, Leopold sat across from her in the dark. The streets of Dunraven Crossing passed in amber windows of gaslight. "You did well tonight," he said. It was, she understood, a high mark of praise from him, the equivalent, in a different man, of something much more generous. "Thank you," she said. Another silence. The carriage moved. The gaslight came and went. "Aldgate spoke to you," Leopold said. Not accusatory, observational, briefly. At the introduction, she kept her eyes on the window. "He seemed interested in making a favorable impression. He's always interested in that." A pause. "What did you make of him?" Rosalind considered the question. Not the answer. She already had the answer. She was considering how much of it to give. "He's careful," she said. "More careful than he wants to appear. Men who work very hard at seeming relaxed usually have something they're managing." The silence that followed was different from the others, longer, with a quality to it she hadn't encountered yet in this house, something attentive, almost involuntary, as though Leopold Carrington had not planned to be interested and found himself there anyway. He did not respond, but when the carriage arrived at Carrington House and the footman opened the door, Leopold stepped out first, as he always did, and then, for the first time, he turned and offered her his hand. Not warmly, not with any softness. Formally, as a matter of basic courtesy, the way a precise man acknowledges a debt. She took it. His grip was brief and steady. He released her hand and walked into the house without looking back. Rosalind stood for a moment on the stone steps, the night air cold against her face, the gas lamp above the door making its small, steady light. A hand offered, nothing more. A gesture so contained it could barely be called a gesture at all. And yet, she went inside, climbed the stairs, sat at the small writing desk in her room, and opened the leather notebook to a page she had marked 3 weeks before she ever set foot in Carrington House. At the top of the page, in her own careful handwriting, were 4 words, the Dunraven deed of record. She had written them in the summer of '84. She had been waiting since then to understand what they meant. She was beginning to understand now. She did not sleep well that night. Not from fear, from the particular wakefulness of a mind that has started to see the shape of something it has been searching for a long time and cannot yet afford to look at directly. Outside, Dunraven Crossing settled into its autumn dark. The steel mills ran through the night, the river moved beneath its bridges, and in the study, 2 floors below her, a light burned until past midnight. Leopold Carrington at his desk, reading documents she had not yet seen, making decisions she did not yet know about, in a world he had constructed around the certainty that he controlled every variable. He had not, until 9 days ago, accounted for Rosalind. The letter arrived on a Wednesday. Rosalind knew it was significant before she opened it, not because of the seal, though the seal was unfamiliar, a small pressed emblem she did not recognize from any firm in Dunraven Crossing. She knew because of the way it had been delivered. Not through the front door, not by the regular post that Mrs. Holt sorted each morning and left on the silver tray in the entrance hall. This one had been slipped beneath the door of the library. The unused library, with the cold fireplace where only one person in Carrington House had been known to spend her mornings. Someone knew she was there. She set down her tea. She picked up the letter. She opened it without hurry, the way she did most things that frightened her, with a steadiness that looked from the outside exactly like calm. Inside was a single sheet of paper. No salutation, No signature. Only 2 lines, written in a clerk's precise hand. The deed transferring Beaumont land holdings to Carrington Steel, recorded August 1884, was filed under a power of attorney that Edmund Beaumont disputes ever signing. The original document is held at the county recorder's office. You have until the 1st of December. Rosalind read it twice. Then she folded it carefully, placed it inside the leather notebook, and sat very still for a moment while the clock on the mantelpiece marked its seconds, and the fire she had finally asked Mrs. Holt to light crackled quietly in the grate. The 1st of December was 19 days away. She had known in the abstract for 3 years. That was the honest accounting of it. She had known something was wrong with the transferred documents since the summer of '84, when she was helping her father organize his papers and found a discrepancy so small it could have been a clerical error, so precise it almost certainly was not. A power of attorney filed on a Tuesday in August, authorizing the transfer of the Beaumont land holdings along the eastern Dunraven corridor to Carrington Steel, her father's signature at the bottom. Her father, who had been in a hospital bed in Philadelphia that entire week, recovering from a fever that had nearly killed him, and who had signed nothing because he had been unconscious for 4 of those 7 days and barely coherent for the other 3. Rosalind had not confronted anyone. She had not gone to a lawyer. She had not written letters or made accusations or done any of the things a person does when they have discovered something they know how to use. She had opened the leather notebook and written it down. Every detail, every date, every document number. She had spent the next 3 years quietly and methodically building a record because she understood, with the clarity of someone who had grown up watching power operate at close range, that an accusation without architecture was just noise, and noise in Dunraven Crossing was dealt with efficiently and without mercy. She had been waiting for the right moment. She had not expected the moment to arrive 19 days before December 1st, in a letter slipped under the library door of the man whose name was on the fraudulent deed. The question now was not whether to act. The question was whether Leopold Carrington knew. She watched him more carefully after that. Not obviously. She had never been obvious about anything, but with a new precision, a narrowed focus, the way you look at something you previously saw in low light and are now examining in full clarity. What she found complicated everything. Leopold was not a man who hid things badly. He hid things the way he did everything. Through architecture, through structure, through the deliberate construction of systems that kept information exactly where he wanted it and people exactly where he needed them. His Wednesday meetings, his documents at dinner, his study with the door closed and the light burning past midnight. But in the 2 weeks following the letter, she noticed something new. He was making phone calls he did not record in his appointment ledger. She knew this because she had, in the course of managing the household accounts, which he had assigned to her domain without a second thought, legitimate access to the house's administrative schedules, and 3 times in 10 days, the downstairs telephone was occupied for significant periods, during hours when Leopold had no listed appointments. She noted the dates. She noted the approximate durations. She wrote them in the notebook. She also noticed that he had begun to watch her. Not overtly. Leopold Carrington was not an overtly watchful man. He was the kind of man whose attention arrived sideways, peripheral, in the brief moment when he thought you weren't looking back. But she was always looking back. Quietly, indirectly, through the particular skill of a woman who had spent her adult life in rooms where she was underestimated. At dinner on a Thursday evening, 11 days before December 1st, he set his documents aside. This had never happened before. "You've been spending time in the records room," he said. Rosalind looked up from her plate. "The small room off the library?" "Yes, I was reviewing the household property documents for the insurance schedule." She met his gaze without difficulty. "Mrs. Holt mentioned it hadn't been updated since '85. "That's correct," he said. His voice was even. "Did you find everything in order?" "Mostly." She took a sip of water. "There were a few gaps in the land survey records for the Eastern Corridor properties. I assumed they were filed elsewhere." The silence that followed was the longest one yet. 7 seconds. She counted every one of them. "They are," he said. "I'll have my solicitor send copies." "Thank you," she said. "That would be helpful." He picked up his documents. She returned to her dinner. The clock marked its seconds, but something had shifted in the room. Something barometric, pressurized, the way air feels before a storm that hasn't announced itself yet. She could feel it in the particular quality of his stillness, which was no longer the comfortable stillness of a man in complete control of his environment. It was the stillness of a man who was recalculating. She had not shown him the notebook. She had not shown him the letter. She had given him nothing except a question wrapped in household administration, delivered without emphasis, and watched him absorb it. He knew she was looking. He did not know what she had found. The following Tuesday, Thomas Aldgate came to Carrington House. He was not on the appointment ledger. Rosalind was crossing the entrance hall when she heard his voice in the study, raised slightly, which she had never heard from him at the City Hall reception, and Leopold's voice beneath it, low and flat and utterly controlled. She did not stop walking. She went to the library, left the door ajar exactly 2 inches, and sat at the writing desk with the railroad surveys open in front of her. The study was directly across the hall. She could not hear words. She could hear tone, rhythm, the architecture of an argument. Aldgate pressing something, Leopold refusing it. A long silence, Aldgate's voice again with a different quality, something almost imploring beneath the aggression. Then Leopold, one sentence, delivered with such finality that even through 2 closed doors and 15 feet of hallway, it landed with the weight of a verdict. Then nothing. Then footsteps. Then the front door. Rosalind did not look up from the surveys when Leopold crossed the hallway and stopped in the library doorway. She gave it 3 full seconds before she raised her eyes. He looked, for the first time since she had known him, like a man who had been required to spend more than he had budgeted. "Aldgate," she said simply. "A business disagreement." His voice was level, controlled. The effort of the control was the only sign of anything. He seemed agitated. He often is. Leopold looked at her for a moment. That recalibrating look, more frequent now, more searching. "You were in the hall when he arrived." "I was crossing it." She held his gaze. "I didn't listen at doors, Mr. Carrington." She had not said Mr. Carrington in weeks. They had arrived without discussing it, at a first-name formality. Not intimate, but domestic. The return to formality was deliberate, and she watched him register it. "Leopold," he said, correcting it automatically. "Leopold," she repeated, and said nothing else. He came into the library then, fully in, not lingering at the threshold the way he usually did when he found her there. He crossed to the fireplace, stood with his back to it, and looked at her in a way that was different from all the previous ways. Not the assessment of an employer, not the recalibration of a strategist. Something more direct than either, something that had not been planned. "The Eastern Corridor properties," he said. "The surveys you've been reviewing." "Yes." "How much do you understand about how they were acquired?" The question was enormous. She understood exactly how enormous it was, and she understood that he was asking it, not demanding, not accusing, but asking, which was the most significant thing he had done in their entire acquaintance, because he had arrived at a calculation she had not anticipated. He was considering telling her something. She set the survey down on the table. She folded her hands in her lap with the practiced stillness he had noticed on the very first morning she sat in his office, and she made a decision of her own. Quick, quiet, and absolute. "Not yet. I understand enough," she said, "that the record is incomplete." His jaw tightened, almost imperceptibly. "And you intend to complete it." "I intend to understand my household," she said. "That's my domain. You said so yourself." The fire crackled. The clock marked its seconds. Outside, the first real cold of winter was arriving over Dunraven Crossing, settling into the streets and the river and the spaces between buildings with the slow, indifferent certainty of something that does not require permission. Leopold looked at her for a long time. Then he said quietly, almost to himself, the first unguarded thing she had ever heard him say, "I did not forge that document." Rosalind held his gaze. Her hands stayed still, her face stayed still, but in the pocket of her dress, the leather notebook pressed against her side like a heartbeat. "I know," she said, and she watched Leopold Carrington, the richest man in Dunraven Crossing, the most controlled man she had ever encountered, go completely, utterly still, because she did know. She had known for 2 weeks, ever since she had cross-referenced the power of attorney date against 3 other documents, and understood that the signature was not Leopold's doing. It was her father's business partner, a man named Gerald Fitch, who had been quietly liquidating Beaumont assets since '83, using forged instruments and a dead man's silence, and who had allowed an entire family and an entire marriage to be built on the wreckage. The 1st of December was 8 days away. The snow came on a Friday. It arrived quietly, the way important things often do. Not announced, not dramatic, simply present. When Rosalind looked out the library window at 6:30 in the morning, and found the world outside Carrington House had turned white overnight. The streets of Dunraven Crossing were still empty. The gas lamps were still burning, small orange flames made softer by the snow, their light no longer reaching very far. 7 days until December 1st. She had not slept, not from fear. She had moved past fear sometime around 3 in the morning, when she sat at the writing desk in her room and read through the leather notebook from the first page to the last, every entry in her own careful handwriting, 3 years of patient documentation laid out in sequence like a map she had been drawing, without knowing exactly where it ended. She knew where it ended now. She found Leopold in the dining room at 7. He was already dressed, already present in that complete self-contained way of his, but the documents were not beside his plate this morning. He was simply sitting, a cup of coffee in front of him, looking out at the snow with an expression she had not seen on him before, not troubled, not calculating, something quieter and older than either. She sat down at her end of the table. Then, after a moment, she picked up her coffee cup and moved it, past the empty chairs, past the silver candlesticks, past the floral centerpiece that had been replaced twice, and still did not reflect her preferences. She set it down 2 seats to his left, and sat there instead. He looked at her. She set the leather notebook on the table between them. "Gerald Fitch," she said. The name landed in the room like a stone dropped into still water. She watched the ripples move across his face. Recognition first, then something harder, then a stillness so complete it was almost like watching a man decide, in real time, who he intended to be. "You know about Fitch," he said, not a question. "I've known about the forged power of attorney since '84. She kept her voice even. "I didn't know who filed it until 3 weeks ago. I didn't know the full scope of what he had moved through Carrington Steele's accounts until I reviewed the Eastern Corridor surveys." She paused. "He used your company's instruments to transfer my family's land holdings. He filed them under your name, and then he allowed my father to believe that the debt he owed was legitimate, that the transfer had been a consequence of real financial failure, when in fact most of what my father lost was taken from him through documents he never signed." Leopold was looking at the notebook. "How long have you been building that record?" 3 years. A silence, long and complete. "You came into this marriage knowing," he said. "I came into this marriage needing to understand the difference between what you knew and what was done in your name." She met his eyes directly. "Those are not the same thing. I needed to be certain before I decided what to do with what I had. And now you're certain." "Yes." He looked at her for a long moment. Outside, the snow continued to fall. The city was beginning to wake. She could hear the first carriage on the cobblestones, the distant sound of the morning shift beginning at the steel mills. Dunraven Crossing resuming its ordinary business against a white and altered sky. "Fitch has been moving funds through 3 subsidiary accounts since '82, Leopold said. His voice was level, but there was something underneath it. Not quite anger, not quite grief. Something that lived in the territory between them. "I discovered it in September. Not the full extent, not the Beaumont land transfer, not the forged instruments. I knew money had been redirected. I did not know how far back it went or who had been harmed by it." He stopped. "When I found out about your father's debt, the real origin of it, I understood that I could not simply absorb the loss internally and move forward, but I also understood that surfacing it publicly would require destroying something I had spent 20 years building." "Your reputation," she said. "My company," he said. "The people employed by it. 3,000 men working the Dunraven mills, the rail merger that keeps those contracts alive for another decade." He exhaled quietly. "A public fraud investigation does not leave those things intact." Rosalind looked at him, fully, clearly, without the careful management of distance she had maintained for 6 weeks. She saw what was actually there. A man who had discovered too late that the empire he controlled had been built in part on ground he had not surveyed carefully enough. A man who was not guilty of the original wrong and was nonetheless entirely responsible for its consequences. A man who had married a woman he considered a variable and was sitting across from her now because she had placed a leather notebook on the table and he had not looked away. "The county recorder's office," she said. "The original deed of transfer is held there, along with the power of attorney document and the notarization records." She opened the notebook to the last marked page and turned it so he could read it. "These are the document reference numbers, cross-referenced against the dates my father was in the Philadelphia hospital, which I have corroborated through his physician's correspondence." She paused. "This is enough to demonstrate that the transfer was fraudulent and that the debt derived from it was invalid. It is also enough to identify Fitch as the instrument of the fraud. not Carrington Steel as an institution, and not you personally, if it is filed correctly and with the right legal framing. Leopold read the page. He read it slowly, with the focused attention she had observed in him from the beginning, trusting nothing summarized, requiring the primary source. When he finished, he did not speak immediately. He turned back 2 pages and read those as well. Then he closed the notebook and looked at her. "You could have taken this to a lawyer in September," he said, "before the marriage. You could have used it to dissolve the debt without any of this." "I could have," she said. "Why didn't you?" It was the most direct question he had ever asked her. She gave it the honest answer it deserved. "Because a lawsuit against Carrington Steel would have taken 2 years and cost my family the house on Halcyon Street 3 times over before it concluded, regardless of whether we won. And because Clara needed the introduction to Mrs. Hartford's social circle, which required your name, not a courtroom," she paused. "And because I wanted to know who you were before I decided what to do. A document tells you what happened. It doesn't tell you what a person is." The silence that followed was the last of the long silences, the final one in a marriage full of them, and different from all the others. Not empty, not strategic, not the careful management of 2 people maintaining distance inside the same house. This one was full of everything that had been held back for 6 weeks, everything that had moved quietly beneath the surface of formal dinners and cold corridors and railroad surveys read by firelight. Leopold reached across the table and placed his hand over the notebook, not taking it, simply resting his hand there for a moment as though acknowledging the weight of what it contained. "I'll engage Harlan Cross," he said. "He has the standing to file a corrective deed of record without triggering a public investigation. The fraud will be documented, attributed to Fitch, and the Beaumont transfer will be reversed. Your father's debt, the legitimate portion, was $41,000. The remainder was manufactured." He paused. "I will cover the $41,000 personally, not as a term of this marriage, as a correction of a wrong done through my company." Rosalind looked at him. "That isn't necessary." "It is," he said, simply, finally, in the tone of a man who has made a decision and will not be argued out of it. She did not argue. "The merger," she said after a moment. "The Dunraven Rail acquisition? Will it survive this?" "I don't know." He said it without flinching. "Probably not intact. Aldgate has been positioning to take advantage of any instability. If the Eastern Corridor properties are contested even briefly, the financing becomes complicated." He looked at her steadily. "That is a consequence I am prepared to accept." Rosalind looked at this man, who had shaken her hand at a church door, who had sat at the opposite end of a dining room table for 6 weeks, who had offered her his hand once in the dark outside a carriage and then walked away without looking back, who had just told her he was prepared to lose the most significant acquisition of his career in order to correct a wrong he had not committed. She thought about the first morning in his office, the chair she had sat in before he offered it, the conditions she had negotiated into a finalized contract, the 30 minutes notice she had been given, and the fact that she had come anyway. She picked up the leather notebook and held it for a moment. Then she slid it across the table to him. "File it," she said, "all of it, every document, every reference number, everything I have." She met his eyes, "And then let whatever falls, fall." Leopold Carrington looked at the notebook in his hands. He looked at the woman sitting 2 chairs to his left, in a seat she had moved herself to, on a snowy Friday morning in a house that had been cold for a very long time. He did not say thank you. He was not a man who said thank you easily, and she did not need him to be. He simply nodded. Once, with the particular gravity of a man acknowledging something that cannot be undone. Outside, Dunraven Crossing lay white and quiet under its first real snow, the steel mills sending their pale columns into a sky the color of old iron, the river moving beneath its bridges, with the slow indifference of something that has witnessed a great many winters and expects to witness many more. Gerald Fitch was arrested on the 28th of November. The Dunraven Rail merger restructured under new terms the following spring. The Beaumont land transfer was reversed in full, documented and sealed. Leopold Carrington did not recover his position in Dunraven Crossing exactly as it had been. Some things, once examined in full light, cannot be restored to what they were in the dark. He did not try to restore them. He built something different instead, smaller perhaps, and built on ground he had surveyed himself, every deed verified, every record complete. Rosalind stayed, not because of the contract, not because of the $12,000, which she never collected, and not because of Clara's introduction to Mrs. Hartford's social circle, which Leopold arranged regardless, without being reminded. She stayed because she had looked at a man across a very long dining room table for 6 weeks and understood, in the end, the difference between what a person does and what a person is. And because on a snowy Friday morning, he had held her notebook in his hands and chosen, without hesitation, the weight of what was true over the comfort of what was manageable. That was enough. That was, in fact, everything. The empire did not fall. It was simply, finally, built on honest ground.